Yeah,
Oh,
John is recording the call
there we go.
as opposed to the dean at the university I used to work at, which the president at the university I used to work at, who secretly recorded conversations during parties with faculty to gather compromat.
Wow. Well, we are not doing
Yeah.
we are not doing that. Well, this is the first podcast I have done in a long time. You and I have done a podcast in the past, and I remember in addition to some text email interviews. But it's good to have you back. Welcome back to Theo Fantastique.
Thanks. I'm so happy to be here.
Well, let's get the ball rolling. Let me introduce you to folks. I don't know how folks could not know who you are with the work that touches base with what we're doing at Theo Fantastic. But you are professor of religious studies and social development studies at Renison University College. You've written a number of books, many of which touch on religion and the aspects of the fantastic, including Sacred Space, which deals with religion and science fiction, Sacred Terror, Religion and Horror. And then you've got a forthcoming book that I got to get my paws on, Magic, Monsters, and Make Believe, which looks fascinating as you deal with fantasy. But we're going to talk today about your new book, America's Dark Theologian, The Religious Imagination of Stephen King. So I want to
Awesome.
begin on a personal note. What is your personal and as well as your professional attraction to fantastic genres and how this intersects with the religion? How'd you catch this bug?
It's a really interesting story. I was never much of a horror fan growing up. I was much more sci-fi and fantasy, like Fritz Leiber and Fafhrd and the Grey Mouse or that kind of thing. Um, so I'm in Kansas City, and it's about maybe 2005, 2006, and I've got like the flu, so I'm lying on the couch, and the local TV station is running a Hellraiser marathon. And I'd seen them in the video store, but I had never, I'd never picked them up. And Pinhead is like the iconic character, right?
Right.
He's my boy now. But in the fourth one, which is the one that takes place in space, the one that's sort of universally reviled by Hellraiser fans, there's this scene where the human character kind of runs in and he sees Pinhead and he goes, "Oh my God!" And Pinhead in that like awesome Doug Bradley voice says, "Do I look like someone who cares what God thinks?" And at that moment, I swear, John, the whole structure for what became Sacred Terror fell into place with all the scary things in the world. Not for nothing, your recent presidential election, with all the scary things in the world. Why do we so often and so continually go back to the supernatural or the supernatural as it is mediated through religion to tell a scary story? In September, I did 3 or 4 radio interviews, including like with Swiss NPR. Who knew that the Switzerland had an NPR on this movie, The Nun, right?
Right.
Then I figured I talked about, religion and horror, and I thought, I should probably go see the movie. And it was exactly what I expected it to be. But so that kind of drove my interest in it initially. But what I never ever wanted to do was the kind of thing that we talked about before the show, which was I never wanted to write, the gospel according to this or because all that is, in my view, and I talk about this a lot in the fantasy book, the all that is a way of making um, popular culture products that are uncomfortable for Christians palatable.
Mm.
It's so that Christian parents can feel okay about their kids reading Harry Potter. It's so that Christian youth groups can feel okay about watching, the old Hammer horror films, because they've been baptized with this sort of stealth Christian message. And I never ever wanted to do that. I mean, you and I have known each other for a long
I,
time. And so what I started asking was, all right, with Sacred Terror, what are the kind of things that horror tells us that we're afraid of? Well, we're afraid of death, and we're afraid of monsters, and we're afraid of demons, we're afraid of all those kinds of things. But at the ground level, what it tells us is that we are afraid that we have it wrong. It's not horror is not an argument for secularization, even though a lot of you and I know that a lot of people
Right.
will make that argument. It isn't. It's not in place of religion. What horror reveals to us is this extraordinary ambivalence that we have towards the supernatural order, what William James called the unseen order, when it is challenged and confronted by understandings of it that are different than the ones that make us feel good in our everyday life. So fast forward 10 years to America's Dark Theologian. I take that framing and go, okay, what is Stephen King doing with this? And the way that started was I was talking to Jennifer Hammer at NYUP at the American Academy of Religion meeting, and we've been trying to do something for a long time. And she said, well, so what do you got for me? And I said, well, I'd kind of like to do this book on, and I was thinking about something like about Dexter and Breaking Bad and Sons of Anarchy and Why Are We in Love with Bad Guys, that kind of thing. And she says, I don't know what else you got. And I said, well, I said I do have this idea rolling around. I said I'd kind of be interested in seeing what Stephen King has to say about religion. She goes, oh, I really like that. So at the Hartsfield Jackson Airport on the way back from the AAR, I bought the first Stephen King novel I'd read in probably 25 years. It was Doctor Sleep, which you may know is the sequel to The Shining.
Mm-hmm.
And I read it on the plane, and I'm going, oh, dude, there's a lot here. So I did what I do. I bought all of Stephen King's novels, all of his collections of short stories, all the nonfiction he's published. I read what people have read about him and said, okay, what is there here? And it turns out there's an awful lot,
Mm-hmm.
which is why we have this book.
Now, what as you look through that stuff, give me a couple of things that kind of jumped out at you.
All
What
right.
were some aha moments for you?
Okay. So the first big aha moment was how superficially other people have considered King's sort of the way he deals with religion. The example of that is The Stand. If you read virtually any commentary on Stephen King that mentions religion, they almost universally call The Stand his most religious book. It isn't, not by a country mile. In fact, I only spend about a paragraph and a half on it in my own book because and what they do is they take a very superficial definition of religion. I mean, you and I know that religion is way messier and way more complicated
Oh yeah,
than would be palatable.
right,
If we let that out into the world. And the thing with King is big battles about good and evil. Those are not the sole province of religion. Welcome to the Second World War,
right.
right? So, and even though you have sort of a devil figure and sort of a prophet figure, there really isn't that much more going on. And I go, okay, so, and then they have this sort of weird Deus Ex Machina at the end of The Stand, where it's basically King going, I don't have any idea how to finish this book, so I think I'll just blow Las Vegas up, right? So I thought there's got to be more to that. So then I read books like Pet Cemetery, and probably the two books that gave me the most impetus to think about this were Pet Cemetery and a book called Desperation. Pet Cemetery, everybody knows. Desperation, maybe not so much. Um, it is as though King had something like Victor Turner's text, The Ritual Process, open on his desk beside him when he was writing Pet Cemetery. Because as you know, the question that animates the religious imagination in humankind going back however many hundreds of thousand years is the question, what happens when we die, right?
Mm-hmm.
And all of religious imagination is about managing that sort of existential crisis. And Pet Cemetery, there is this scene. I don't know if you remember the novel, but there is this scene when Judd takes Lewis. They're going to bury the cat.
Mm-hmm.
The cat has died. They're going to bury the cat, whose name is Church. And it stands for Winston Churchill. So nobody should read anything into
Right,
that. Right. So they take him, they go to bury Church at what is known as the Pet Cemetery. This is a place in the woods where people go and bury their goldfish and their puppies and their things like that. But just beyond the little pet cemetery is this deadfall. Trees, branches, very dangerous to anybody who knows what a deadfall is when you're hiking. Judd takes him over the deadfall, and it's essentially a step by step ritual journey. And I realized that what I was looking at when I was reading this was the ritual process that I explain in every first and second year religious studies class that I write. So that was one. Desperation. I mean, the thing about The Stand is, if you've read it, I mean, it's a doorstop, man. It's a big, thick book, and it takes place on this grand, grand, grand scale. Desperation takes place, considers similar questions, but it takes place on a much smaller scale. Desperation is about a small group of people who are trapped, excuse me, by an evil entity named Tak in a small, all but abandoned mining town in Nevada. And the main character is a 12-year-old boy named David. David has come to be having conversations with God as the result of praying for a young friend of his who was injured in a car accident. God, if you're there, please save my friend. What? You are there? So this book, I consider it probably one of his most theologically informed works because it considers those questions. What happens when we die? Why do we suffer for no reason at all? And at most particularly, it considers the question of Job, which is to say, why does it appear that God is so unutterably cruel? Right? And then at the end, it leaves open the question, why maybe God isn't in control in the way that we think God is. Whatever you think your God is, it leaves open this idea that I think Stephen King is trying to get at in all of his works, which is, you think you have it figured out? Check this shit out.
Mm. Now, folks may hear the title of your book and they're having trouble connecting the dots. Stephen King, theologian. I mean, I could see the dark part, but the theologian. In your research, not only reading his works, but I don't know if you were able to uncover anything biographically about him. What's his religious background, and what kind of experiences maybe did he have that inform how he writes about religious topics?
It's a really good question, and it's a key question. He himself, he describes himself as a lapsed Methodist, raised in probably a fairly conservative Methodism. Tabitha, his wife, is a lapsed Catholic. So neither of them have any connection to religion, which is very common in horror writers, actually. You find horror writers who had sort of religious upbringing and then moved away from it and then use religion in their horror works. It is impossible, at least in my view, because I tried, it's impossible to map his biography onto his fiction. For example, if you were to look at Philip K. Dick, for example, right? And by the way, just in a shameless plug, there is in the works a companion volume to America's Dark Theologian called America's Reluctant Prophet, The Religious Imagination of Philip K. Dick. Now, in Philip K. Dick, you cannot avoid his own experiences in his life because he wrote about them explicitly in his fiction, sometimes even using his own name. There is a character called Philip K. Dick in the novel Radio Free Albemuth, for example. King, you can't do that. What I mean by theology is this, or theologian is this. Every one of us is a theologian. You're a theologian. I'm a theologian. Buddy down the street is a theologian. Unfortunately, what's happened in society is we have reserved the notion of being a theologian for professional academics, my colleagues, some of my colleagues here in religious studies, or ministers, imams, mullahs, roshis, right?
Right.
rabbis,
Right.
people who are professionally religious. So we have reserved that title. The reality is that we all do theology. Every time we ask, why is this happening to me? Every time we wonder about, is there a God? What does that God look like? Is there more than one? What does she think about the world? Right? Every time one of us asks those questions or make those statements, we are in fact articulating a logic of God. And I put God in quotation marks in the sense that whatever you think that is, we are articulating a logic of God. Um, so when somebody says, I believe Jesus died for my sins, I can't tell you why, or somebody says, um, I believe that Joseph Smith uh, brought the church back to where it should be. I can't tell you why I believe that, but I do.
Mm-hmm.
They are doing theology. So what
Mm-hmm.
Stephen King is doing is he is probing at questions. And this is where I make, I think, an important distinction in the book. When you or your listeners think of what we mean by religious questions, right?
Right.
How did we get here? Where do we go when we die? Why do we suffer? Is there a God? Does life have meaning? What I argue in this book and in the fantasy book is that these are not religious questions. Religion has claimed to have answered them. Religion has claimed a certain proprietary ownership of them, and we certainly treat them as religious questions, but they're not. They are what I call properly human questions, which is to say, we ask them not because we are religious or because we are a member of a particular faith community. We ask them because we are human, and it's part of what makes us human. And what Stephen King is doing is he's taking those properly human questions, those questions about meaning and purpose and origins and teleology, and he's placing them in context where he never gives you an answer. Like, for example, there is no way that you can do a theology. Hello, cat. There is no way that you can do the fact that there is a black cat now in the background is awesome. Um, there is no way that you can do a theology of Stephen King the way you could do, for example, as you and I both know well, a theology of H.P. Lovecraft.
Mm-hmm.
There's no there's no version of the Cthulhu mythos that operates in Stephen King. What Stephen King, and he's very clear about this, what Stephen King is really, really interested in is questions and questioning the answers we think we have. So you take a book like Under the Dome. The basic storyline is a small town, New England town, is cut off by this invisible barrier. What happens? You know, people die, people pray. There are very religious characters in it. They're almost universally vile, but they're there. Um, and at the end, it turns out, and I'm sorry for the spoiler, but at the end, it turns out that what is going on cosmologically is not anything like we imagine. What it is, it's essentially, alien adolescents, you know, seeing what happens to the tiny ants that they've managed to trap under their dome, the way kids play with ants in a magnifying glass. What that does is it throws open to that sense of ambivalence any question of meaning and purpose to our existence. Because, in point of fact, in the dome, all kinds of people pray for salvation, but nobody gets out alive. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Some of what you said leads or connects to this next question of mine. We make these stark categories: religion, myth, storytelling, pop culture, right? And one of the criticisms I get sometimes from conservative religious folk is, I can see your work in religion, but the stuff you do in pop culture and horror and all that dark stuff, that just doesn't seem appropriate. You seem to, in your work, you recognize some distinctions, but not necessarily rigid divisions between religion, myth, storytelling, and this kind of thing. How do you see these things blending together? And
Oh,
you
yeah.
already touched on they raise similar issues.
Well, here's the thing. Um, religion, the reason that I argue that religion and horror, particularly, far more than fantasy, far more than science fiction, but the reason I argue that religion and horror are what I call cultural siblings is because they are concerned with exactly the same questions and they operate on the same premise. The premise is, especially, I mean, I'm not talking about like torture porn or stuff like that. What I'm talking about is sort of supernaturally oriented horror, the stuff that you and I are really interested in,
Mhm.
is they operate on the same premise that what we see here in this life is not all there is, that we go on, that there is something that survives. What we don't know is how it survives, in what form, what it means to survive. Religions give all kinds of answers. Do you go up to heaven if you're a Christian? Do you go to, do you go to paradise if you're a Muslim? Do you sort of recycle if you're one or another kind of Buddhist? And if you're the kind that sort of, ratchets up and once you're human, you're kind of always human, or, the other kind where you can slowly go up and down the ladders, like, human one life, sloth the next, right? So, but all of that is tied together by this sort of this knot of this is not the end and this is not all there is. Horror, more than any other genre, supernatural horror, builds on that same idea. So what King is questioning throughout is how do we know that what we think is what happens is what actually happens? Because, you and I've talked about this before, and I play this game with my students. I can't prove that God exists, and by the way, neither can any of you, right? So for me, I think horror is in fact the richest vein of popular culture, and the one that, we when I wrote Sacred Terror, um, an early professor of mine said to me, for you, probably the best way to write is to find something that you disagree with and then make your own argument for a better way of thinking about it. So when I started looking after watching Pinhead, and I started looking at, I found a peer-reviewed article that said they were reviewing Stigmata. Remember Stigmata?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah, they were reviewing Stigmata, and they said, you don't expect to find spirituality and religion in a horror movie. And I went, dude, you just haven't been paying attention. You've been shopping in the wrong part of the video store, right? Or then, another guy said, look, horror and religion, or religion and horror, is all just about I'm paraphrasing, but it's basically just about mocking and making fun of religion. And sometimes that's true. But once you kind of get past those few instances, you realize that both religion and horror are about the stories that keep us up at night. Religion is about the stories that keep us up at night because religion is not about beliefs. It's not about doctrines. It's not about rituals. It's not about practices. I mean, those are all there,
Mm-hmm.
sure. But religion is a set of layered stories about how we think the world works. And horror is a set of stories that challenges, in essence, those claims about how the world works, at least as it works itself out in Stephen King.
Yeah, and many times those stories in religion are very dark stories.
They're
Even
totally
the
dark.
biblical tradition, even though, in my opinion, I think I've stated this on my blog before, but I think, in my opinion, conservative Christians sanitize in their own mind their own religious tradition and emphasize the more positive aspects and
Oh,
don't
yeah.
see the very dark aspects of it. So there's a very natural connection to horror, in my view,
Yeah.
if you take your tradition at face value. But that would be my view.
Okay. So there's this. Let's move away from Stephen King for a second because there's this great. I use this example in Sacred Terror, but it's an example that I love because I will pretty much watch Christopher Walken do anything. And this is a '90s movie called The Prophecy.
Okay, I
Remember
remember
The
that.
Prophecy?
Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
and he is in fact the angel Gabriel,
Hmm.
who has decided that it's enough with the talking monkeys, right? And God's love for the talking monkeys. It's time for a second war in heaven. And he comes down, and sort of the two main human characters are having this conversation. One is a guy who became a cop, but he's a lapsed wannabe priest. The other is a teacher. And he says, and she goes, "You mean he's an angel?" And the male character says, "Do you ever read your Bible, Catherine? Who do you think God sends when he needs a killing? He sends an angel." You have to wonder what a creature like that must be like. Your entire existence spent praising your God with one wing always dipped in blood. Would you ever really want to meet an angel? Then you think about Matt Damon's great line in Dogma, because he's the angel of death in Dogma, right? And he says, I mean, genocide. It's just the most exhausting thing you can do outside of soccer. So we do.
Yeah.
I was going to say, yeah, absolutely. And by the way, not for nothing. I mean, I've taken my fair share of shots at conservative Christians, but let's be clear. Every religion finds the canon within a canon
Mm-hmm.
that makes it feel good about itself.
Right.
Liberal Christians, as you know, I was a United Church minister for 11 years, and the United Church is as liberal a denomination as you're going to be able to find anywhere. And they are just as picky and choosy about what they're willing to say is the word of God or appropriate theology as anybody else. Muslims do it, Buddhists do it, Sikhs do it, birds and bees do it.
How does your work as a sociologist play a part in not only your analysis of King, but the other works that you've done in religion and pop culture?
Yeah, because it's a good question. I mean, what I'm really interested in is what um, I'm interested in how groups believe what they believe, and now I'm becoming more and more interested in how story informs those beliefs. We are, as a species, addicted to narrative. We give ourselves meaning and space and place in the universe according to the stories we tell. So, I want to know, what are this particular suite of stories say to people. Now, I've talked to people who've read Stephen King and found way more comfort in what they've read than in their local church. Now, I haven't done a survey. I haven't done, sort of gone out there and talked to, hundreds of, I don't like people enough to go do that. The, um, but, anecdotally, when people hear about this book that I've written or when I was writing it, I had any number of conversations at parties or this or that gathering where somebody would say, I remember reading, Misery, and it spoke to me in a way that nothing else had. And I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. The other thing that I'm interested in, and I think this is your interest in pop cultural as well, is I think it is sort of the conceit of the academy that thinks that we matter more than we do. For example, how many conversations, and maybe you've been involved in more of them, but I haven't, but how many conversations have you been involved in that began with the question, so did you see that article in the latest journal of pastoral theology? Right?
Right.
As opposed to the number of conversations that you've been in that began with something like, dude, did you see what happened on The Walking Dead last night? You go, yeah, can you believe it? Right? Or did you read the latest X novel? Or have you seen the latest Z movie? Right? Pop culture, far more than peer reviewed journals, for goodness sake. Pop culture is the air that we breathe. It's like the water in the goldfish bowl that is around us all the time. I regularly ask um, You do the little Spock sign with your hand, right?
Mm-hmm.
I regularly ask classes if they know what that is. And they all go, they all know,
Right.
live long and prosper. I said, really, where's it come from? It comes from Star Trek. How many Star Trek fans? Like two hands go up. But they still know. Or you say, may the force be with you. And some of them are funny. They go, and also with you. But, but even if it's not, even, even if they're not Star Wars fans, they know it.
Yeah.
So it in a way that they don't know very many other things. So this is, I think, by the way, it took 4 books to get to this understanding.
Mm.
So I'm a bit dim and a bit slow, but um, pop culture is way more important than the Academy has been willing to give it credit for. It is way more influential in the way people live their lives. It is way more influential in the decisions they make and the stories they tell. I'll give you just one. You're a social psychologist, so here's a principle that I find fascinating. It's called source dissociation. It means that we tend to forget where we learned something if we agree with what it tells us. So, for example, I say that when I used to teach in the US, I would point out to my American students, I'm very sorry to tell you this, but the Americans did not go ashore first on D Day. They sort of look at me, Canadian. And I said, no, but for the Canadians and the British, you would never have made it to the beaches. I mean, that's just a fact of history. And they go, well, no, 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 that isn't the way it is. I said, really, tell me where you learned what you know then. And they go, well, I saw it on television. Really?
Mm-hmm.
Where did you see it? Well, there was that, and I've actually had somebody say that documentary, Saving Private Ryan.
That's right.
So you see it, we hear it in a story, but it reinforces things that we believe, and we tend to forget where we learned it, especially when it gets reinforced from different sources. So you have Saving Private Ryan tied up with Band of Brothers, which appeared at roughly the same time,
Mm-hmm.
even though, if I can remember my factoid correctly, the Saving Private Ryan story is actually based on a Civil War example. Um, I may be wrong, but um, this gets confused in our head. So when we see something about, you know, exorcism or nuns or demons or something like that, it gets, especially when it's reinforced by a religious community that says something like demons are real. Like, remember Bob Larson being like a freelance exorcist, roaming the country, Roman the country, he's seeking whom he could exorcise, right?
I think
Uh,
he's still out there.
He's still out there. His daughter's doing it now, though. It's
Oh,
You should check it out. It's totally like an episode of Cheerleaders for Christ.
I mean, he started the Conjuring franchise long before the Conjuring did. I mean,
Oh yeah. And I mean, he used to be super anti-Catholic, but then once he realized he had a real advocate in the Vatican, Gabriel Amorth, who's sort of like the quasi-official exorcist over there now. He's like, okay, now I've got somebody I can talk to about demons. But so what happens is all of this stuff through processes like source dissociation and all these social psychological processes, they get all jumbled up in our brains. And I think what Stephen King is trying to do, and what I'm trying to do in my book, and all of my work, in fact, is trying to tease these threads apart and ask the question, okay, what's the story they're telling us? And what does that story mean for us? And I go right back to the beginning where I said, with Stephen King, what it means is the answers we come up with may satisfy us for the moment, but they will never satisfy us forever.
mm. Maybe you've already touched on this in some of the examples you've talked about, but can you think of what one example that really stands out for you where Stephen King, as a dark theologian, thinking through the issues himself and raising questions, challenges a theological assumption that a conservative religious believer might have that for them is a matter of settled theology? but
Sure,
it's questionable and it's darker than they might be willing to recognize.
sure. Um, I think rather than rather than one single one, I'm going to point to a chapter that I think I titled 40 Years in Maine, The Varieties of Religious Experience. You know this famous book by William James, The Varieties of Religious
Mm-hmm.
Experience. What I do is I look at four novels that are written over a 40-year period. And what they do, I look at Carrie, The Dead Zone, Revival, which is his nod to Frankenstein, and Under the Dome. And what I'm looking at in each of those is um, the ways in which people confronted with the experiences of their lives that we all face react to the God that they think is there. For example, I think the most interesting and most important character in Carrie is not Carrie. The most important character is her mother. And this is the problem with seeing a movie.
Mm-hmm.
You don't really get this subtlety because Carrie's mother, Margaret, is Jonathan Edwards' sinner caught in the hands of an angry God. This is a woman who is so consumed with that sense of evangelical guilt
Mm-hmm.
that with the worm theology,
Right.
right,
Yep.
such a worm am I, right? The worm
Mm-hmm.
theology, which is in fact the bedrock of systematic theology for many conservative Christians, whether they are evangelical or Catholic or Orthodox, which is to say, we are all sinners, born sinners. There's nothing we can do to stop it. We can only throw ourselves on the mercy of this being, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Margaret lives her life. I mean, she left the primitive Baptists because they were too liberal.
Right.
Okay, and she lives this life consumed with fear of this particular God because of that theological principle. Vera Smith, on the other hand, who is the mother in the novel The Dead Zone, she is that kind of believer. She's more of the prosperity gospel kind of believer, where she believes that no matter what happens, she is absolutely at the center of God's plan for her. So her son is in a terrible accident. Oh my God, why have you done this? It must be to teach us a lesson. And of course it's never about her.
Mm-hmm.
It's about it's about you, husband, and the cigars you smoke and your swearing and the beer you drink. That's why God killed two people and put our son in the hospital, is to teach us a lesson. I mean, that kind of unbelievable solipsism that lies at the heart of a lot of religious belief, like that we are the center of the universe, right? And everything that's going on around us is all intended to teach us a lesson.
Mm-hmm.
So that we move through that. Then you move to a Methodist pastor named Charlie Jacobs. Jacob is obviously the metaphor there. He loses his family in an accident. This takes place in the 1950s, 60s. Small Maine town. He loses his family. And what happens for him is he starts asking the question, why does God allow suffering? And what he does is he comes up with the answer that an awful lot of people have come up with. You and I both know that the question of theodicy is the single most potent
Mm-hmm.
challenge to
Mm-hmm.
the idea of a loving God. And so what he does is he embarks on this quest to figure out what is going on. And if Salem's Lot is King's nod to Dracula, I argue that Revival is his nod to Frankenstein. And what he finds at the end is what happens after death is far more terrifying than anything any religion could ever imagine. Finally, we come to Piper, who is the minister in Under the Dome. She had the same thing. lost her family in an accident. She is actually a much more real character for me, because what happens when people move along the continuum of religious belief, from ardent believer to questioning to trying to reevaluate? We both know what that journey looks like, right? You and me.
Mm-hmm.
And um, it's rarely a quick thing to go from belief to disbelief. And through Piper's eyes, you watch this, why did you let my children and my husband die? To she starts praying to the, I think she starts calling it the great not there. So she moves along this continuum from ardent believer through questioner, through agnostic, to what I would probably call a soft atheist, in the sense that she does not believe there is evidence to support the proposition of the God she's meant to believe in, but she's not willing to exclude the possibility altogether, the way a hard atheist would.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, rather than one particular example, what each of those story worlds does is take a settled principle and kind of unpack it
Mm-hmm.
and show you, if you take this to its logical extension, this is what it looks like. If you take that sinner in the hands of an angry God, that original sin must, it's almost like it's as though you took Bill Bright's four spiritual laws and just put it out to seed someplace. You can have really bad things happen. If you take sort of the Kenneth Copeland model of always being at the center of whatever God's plan is, you can turn any situation around to your benefit. And then you have these other situations where you either quickly or slowly move away from this idea of God at all. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. One last question for you, a little speculation on your part. We live in a time when we've seen that rise in the religious nuns, not the nuns as in Catholic, but
Yep.
NONES. Mainstream religions, even evangelicalism in America, that's really in the past held on to its numbers fairly well. They're seeing declines. Mainline Protestantism is seeing declines. Do you think that maybe Stephen King, as a dark theologian, is wrestling with religious and human ideas in better ways that's going to speak to larger sections of American society and even beyond that than so-called light theologians might be with their pop spirituality books?
Yeah, I actually think so. I mean, I don't. It's just, it is conjecture, but pop theologians, the so-called light theologians, their books sell when they manage to get on Oprah. The only reason, anybody pays any attention to Eckhart Tolle, I'm not sure why they would, but the only reason they pay attention to him is because he managed to get Oprah to recommend him. How many of those, if you wander into a Christian bookstore or you wander into the self-help section, they're always turning over. They're always churning, right? There's always somebody new coming up with a new secret or a new way or a new method. And there's a little flash in the pan for a while. And then, when's the last time you heard of the author of The Secret, right?
Right, right.
Go to the horror section of the bookstore. Stephen King has, now there are books that do not do this kind of thing in him. Dolores Claiborne doesn't, for example. The End of Watch series doesn't, for example. But an awful lot of his, there are whole shelves that are filled with them, because he's constantly coming back to the same set of questions, never satisfied with providing an answer. And I think that's why he is more accessible, certainly, than people who claim to provide an answer. Because the thing with an answer is, it only satisfies until it doesn't. It only satisfies, oh, God will take care of us, in our pain and suffering. That's fine as long as it's somebody else suffering.
Mm,
The moment you lose something that you care about or somebody that you care about, that will plunge you into the moment of saying, where the hell were you then? Right?
mm. Right. Oh yeah.
And answers only work until they don't. The questions are forever. And that's what he's interested in. And that's why I think, what my argument is that he's so popular. One of the reasons.
Yeah. Anything else you want to say about the book as we bring the formal part of the recorded interview to an end?
I think, well, yeah, one more thing. It got 2.5 stars from Christianity Today,
Okay, that's saying something.
which I can listen, for me, I count that as something of a win.
That's right.
You know, they misunderstood it. I'll just say that right off the bat. They misunderstood it. They were looking for the gospel according to Stephen King,
Mm,
because they wanted it to be about reality maintenance. But I think it should be on everybody's Christmas list, and multiple copies should be bought for all your friends.
that's
But I,
right.
but I really do appreciate the chance to talk to you about it. I really do.
Well, we've been meaning to do this for a while, and things have gotten in the way. But I'm glad we hooked up, and I hope with other things you've got in the pipeline that you come back and we'll do it again.
Well, let's talk about the fantasy book in the new year.
Hey, that sounds good, man. Appreciate it.
Okay.
Thanks for coming by.
Bye bye.